Imagine a world where murderers routinely vanish into the night, slipping through the fingers of a justice system that relies entirely on fading human memories and deeply flawed physical measurements. In this era of uncertainty, catching a phantom relied more on luck than on science. Yet it was against this shadowy backdrop that a single careless touch would shift the course of criminal history forever. An invisible mark left behind during a sudden and violent struggle would soon become the ultimate silent witness. Hello, and welcome to another deep dive into the true crime archives. The year 1910 cast a heavy, suffocating shadow over the sprawling metropolis of Chicago, a city that was rapidly transforming into an industrial titan on the world stage. The air was perpetually thick with the acrid soot of 1,000 roaring steel mills, mixing with the metallic screech of elevated train cars and the relentless, blood-soaked churning of the stockyards that stretched for miles across the horizon. This was a place of explosive economic growth and unbridled ambition, drawing countless thousands of souls from every corner of the globe who were looking to forge a new destiny amidst the deafening cacophony of progress. Yet, beneath this glittering veneer of booming prosperity and architectural marvels lay a much darker, far more treacherous reality. As the city's population aggressively swelled to over 2 million inhabitants in a remarkably short span of time, the labyrinthine streets, dimly lit alleyways, and fiercely crowded tenements became the perfect untamed breeding ground for a thriving criminal underworld. The very urban anonymity that offered a fresh, hopeful start to honest, hard-working laborers also provided the ultimate, impenetrable cloak of invisibility for thieves, grifters, and violent predators who stalked the night. Honest citizens went to sleep with a lingering, cold sense of dread, meticulously double-locking their heavy wooden doors against an unseen tide of lawlessness that seemed to effortlessly seep through the cracks of their rapidly modernizing world. In this chaotic, high-stakes environment, local law enforcement found themselves desperately trying to hold back the rising floodwaters of crime with tools that were fundamentally inadequate for policing a modern, densely packed metropolis. If a man committed a brutal, unforgivable crime in the dead of night and subsequently melted back into the smog-choked, labyrinthine alleys of the South Side, tracking him down was an exercise in agonizing, often entirely fruitless frustration. The critical question haunting every seasoned detective was not merely how to physically locate a suspect in a sea of millions, but how to definitively, legally prove a man was exactly who they claimed he was once he was standing right in front of them. It wasn't long before a supposedly infallible scientific method emerged as the ultimate weapon of the police force, promising a foolproof way to catalogue the criminal element. During this era, the standard operating procedure across major American precincts was heavily reliant on the Bertillon system, a highly complex method of criminal identification, originally developed in France, that focused entirely on anthropometry, or the meticulous measurement of the human body. Step inside any bustling, chaotic, smoke-filled police station of the early 20th century, and you would witness a scene that looked vastly more like a bizarre, morbid anatomical laboratory than a traditional hub of justice. Exhausted officers, sweating profusely beneath the harsh, flickering, yellow glow of gas lamps, meticulously wielded heavy metal calipers, large wooden rulers, and rigid cloth tape measures on a daily basis. They were strictly tasked with recording exactly 11 specific physical measurements of every single arrested individual who crossed their threshold. These stressed clerks painstakingly logged the exact length of a suspect's middle finger, the precise circumference of their skull from front to back, the total span of their outstretched arms, and the exact length of their left foot down to the millimeter. The fundamental, unwavering belief underlying this incredibly exhaustive physical process was that no two human beings could possibly possess the exact same mathematical combination of bone measurements once their skeletons had reached full physical maturity. These intricate dimensions were then hurriedly scribbled onto thick cardstock alongside written physical descriptions, and a standard, unsmiling mugshot subsequently filed away in towering, imposing wooden cabinets that stretched from the floor all the way to the ceiling. However, the harsh, undeniable reality was that this labor-intensive, highly championed system was critically flawed, acting as little more than a fragile house of cards teetering dangerously on the brink of total collapse. The fatal vulnerability of the Bertillon method lay in its absolute, unyielding dependence on the precision of human operators and the misguided assumption regarding the static nature of the human body. A tired, overworked booking clerk hastily misreading a heavy metal caliper by a mere fraction of a millimeter, or a cunning suspect simply slouching their shoulders and shifting their weight during a measurement session, could easily result in an entirely different anthropometric profile being recorded. Furthermore, hardened, career criminals quickly learned to mercilessly exploit these glaring administrative loopholes, routinely changing their names, deliberately altering their facial hair, or utilizing a rotating roster of different aliases to slip right through the gaping cracks of the justice system. A violent, dangerous repeat offender could simply migrate to a different city ward, effortlessly adopt a brand new identity, and be processed by the courts as a harmless, first-time petty thief, leaving the truly innocent public dangerously exposed to predators who walked freely among them. The long arm of the law was essentially blind, relying on a deeply fallible system of human memory and crude geometry, blissfully unaware that a revolutionary, undeniable signature of identity was quietly waiting to be discovered. Miles away from the teeming, smoke-filled police precincts and the bureaucratic failures of the city's justice system, a man named Clarence Hiller was simply trying to carve out a peaceful existence for his loved ones. Residing in a modest, two-story home in the relatively quiet, working-class neighborhood of the south side of Chicago, Hiller was a highly dedicated and hard-working railway clerk. His life was not one of glamorous excess or dangerous underworld ties, but rather one defined by the rhythmic predictability of the railroad timetables, honest daily labor, and a deep, unwavering devotion to his wife and 4 children. In an era where the city was rapidly expanding and frequently shedding its moral compass, the Hiller residence stood as a sanctuary of domestic tranquility, a safe haven shielded from the industrial grit and rising violence that plagued the broader metropolis. Clarence was the quintessential family man, representing the countless innocent citizens who fervently trusted that keeping their heads down, working hard, and locking their heavy wooden doors at night would be more than enough to keep the encroaching darkness at bay. However, that fragile illusion of safety was irrevocably shattered on the unusually warm, deeply unsettling night of September 19, 1910. The Hiller household had long since retired for the evening, surrendering to a deep, restorative sleep while the rest of the city hummed its distant, metallic tune under the cover of darkness. Sometime in the dead of night, the profound, comforting silence of the home was abruptly pierced by a sound that instantly triggers the primal fear of any parent. The faint, unmistakable creak of a wooden floorboard somewhere in the pitch-black hallway. Clarence Hiller stirred from his bed, his senses suddenly heightened as a heavy wave of cold dread washed over him. As he strained his eyes against the absolute darkness, the horrifying reality of the situation began to set in. This was not the innocent, clumsy footstep of a child wandering out of their bedroom for a glass of water, but the heavy, deliberate movement of a stranger violently violating the sanctity of their home. A shadowy figure was creeping stealthily through the corridor, rummaging through the family's personal belongings in the suffocating gloom. Driven by the fierce, instinctual need to protect his sleeping wife and children, Clarence did not hesitate to confront the terrifying unknown. He lunged out of his bedroom into the narrow, unlit hallway, intercepting the intruder near the landing of the main staircase. What followed was a sudden, brutally violent physical struggle that plunged the quiet home into absolute chaos. In the pitch black, the two men grappled desperately, their heavy bodies slamming violently against the walls and the wooden banister as they fought aggressively for control. The air was instantly filled with the frantic sounds of heavy, labored breathing, muffled grunts of pain, and the terrifying thud of fists connecting in the dark. Clarence, though merely a civilian railway clerk, fought with the unmatched ferocity of a father defending his family, actively pushing the unseen assailant back toward the top of the stairs. But the desperate, heroic struggle was tragically short-lived. A blinding flash of orange light abruptly illuminated the terrified faces of the two men, immediately followed by the deafening, ear-splitting roar of a revolver discharging in the enclosed residential space. The intruder had managed to draw a hidden weapon, firing two fatal shots point-blank into Clarence Hiller's body. The mortally wounded father collapsed, tumbling down the wooden stairs to the front entrance as the chaotic echoes of the gunfire violently woke his terrified wife and children from their sleep. As agonizing screams began to fill the previously quiet home, the panicked killer frantically scrambled out the front door, disappearing seamlessly into the vast, protective cloak of the Chicago night. By the time the neighborhood had roused from the terrifying commotion, and the local authorities finally arrived on the bloody scene, it was far too late. They were met with a scene of profound, gut-wrenching tragedy. A grieving widow weeping over the lifeless body of her husband, a family irrevocably destroyed in a matter of violent minutes, and an agonizingly cold trail. To the seasoned detectives surveying the carnage, it looked exactly like the kind of random, senseless urban violence that the city was notorious for, a crime destined to remain unsolved forever, swallowed whole by the anonymous streets. It seemed the Phantom had escaped justice entirely. It wasn't long, however, before a highly significant clue emerged, revealing that amidst the chaos and blood, the killer had unknowingly left behind an unprecedented calling card that the Chicago police had never seen before. The echo of the fatal gunshots had barely faded into the heavy, humid Chicago night before the entire South Side neighborhood was jolted violently awake. Windows flew open along the normally peaceful residential block, and frantic voices pierced the darkness, desperately demanding to know the source of the terrifying commotion. Within minutes, the shrill, urgent trill of police whistles began cutting through the stagnant air, signaling the rapid convergence of local patrolmen upon the scene of the tragedy. Heavy leather boots pounded aggressively against the uneven pavement as officers rushed to throw a hasty dragnet over the surrounding streets, their handheld lanterns casting long, distorted shadows against the brick facades. A palpable sense of panic spread like wildfire among the awakened residents, heavily fueled by the terrifying realization that a ruthless killer, having just destroyed a respected family, was actively slipping through their backyards and narrow alleyways. However, in his desperate bid for freedom, the phantom of the Hiller household made a critical miscalculation in the dark. The sprawling, labyrinthine nature of the city, which usually offered a perfect, impenetrable sanctuary for fleeing criminals, suddenly proved to be a tightening trap. Less than half a mile from the chaotic, blood-soaked scene of the murder, a pair of sharp-eyed officers on neighborhood patrol spotted a solitary, highly suspicious figure moving erratically through the gloom. The man was panting heavily, moving with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of someone desperately trying to outrun their own violent actions. The officers swiftly intercepted him, aggressively backing the suspect into a corner before he could completely melt away into the industrial smog. When they finally dragged him under the harsh, flickering yellow halo of a nearby gas lamp to establish his identity, the authorities found themselves staring directly into the hardened, defiant face of Thomas Jennings. At a passing glance, Jennings might have easily blended in with the thousands of transient laborers wandering the city at night, but a closer, more meticulous inspection by the arresting officers revealed a highly disturbing, unspoken narrative. His physical state was a chaotic canvas of fresh violence that perfectly mirrored the brutal struggle that had just occurred on Clarence Hiller's wooden staircase. Jennings's clothing was noticeably torn and disheveled, while his hands and arms bore fresh, bloody scratches, unmistakable defensive wounds, highly indicative of a desperate, close-quarters physical altercation. Even more chillingly, a rapid, forceful pat-down of his person yielded a heavy revolver concealed in his pockets, its barrel still carrying the distinct, acrid scent of recently fired gunpowder. To complete this grim mosaic of guilt, his heavy overcoat was visibly stained with coarse sand, a strangely specific detail that felt entirely out of place for a man simply taking an innocent midnight stroll. It wasn't long before a grim reality set in for the seasoned detectives handling the suspect. To the arresting officers on the street, the narrative seemed entirely straightforward. They had literally caught the murderer red-handed, his body still bearing the fresh, undeniable physical scars of the brutal crime he had just committed. Jennings, however, proved to be remarkably stoic, immediately and vehemently denying any involvement in the Hiller tragedy and refusing to offer even a sliver of a confession. In the deeply flawed, highly archaic justice system of 1910, this staunch denial presented a massive, potentially insurmountable legal hurdle for the prosecution. Physical clues like a scratched hand, a torn coat, or a recently fired weapon were ultimately considered strictly circumstantial evidence by the conservative courts of the era. Without a credible, surviving eyewitness who had clearly seen his face in that pitch-black hallway, a clever defense attorney could easily argue that Jennings had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, perhaps sustaining his injuries in an entirely unrelated tavern brawl. The police knew in their gut they had the right man securely in handcuffs, but without a definitive, scientifically undeniable link to place him inside that specific house, this seemingly airtight case was dangerously close to falling apart at trial. While frustrated detectives at the smoke-filled precinct were repeatedly hitting a solid brick wall, interrogating the incredibly defiant Thomas Jennings. A separate team of weary investigators was meticulously combing through the blood-stained Hiller residence for any hidden narrative the shadows might have concealed. To truly comprehend the monumental, history-altering breakthrough that was about to occur as the sun began to rise over Chicago, one must briefly rewind the clock to just a few hours before the horrific tragedy unfolded. On the relatively peaceful sunlit afternoon of September 19, Clarence Hiller had engaged in a perfectly mundane, wonderfully innocent household chore. Driven by a deep, protective sense of domestic pride and a desire to maintain the welcoming appearance of his beloved family home, the dedicated railway clerk had spent a portion of his day carefully applying a thick, fresh coat of white paint to the wooden railing of his rear porch. It was an act of ordinary suburban maintenance, a simple fatherly duty that absolutely no one in the world could have possibly predicted would soon transform into a lethal, inescapable forensic trap for a ruthless murderer. As the chaotic, terrifying night finally gave way to the harsh, revealing light of dawn, crime scene investigators deliberately focused their intense attention on a first-floor rear window, definitively determining it to be the exact point of entry utilized by the phantom intruder. Situated directly adjacent to this compromised window was the very wooden banister that Clarence had so meticulously coated just hours prior. The cool autumn night air had been heavily humid, meaning the thick layer of oil-based enamel had not yet fully cured by the time the killer vaulted over it in the pitch black. As an eagle-eyed detective leaned in closely to inspect the physical mechanics of the break-in, his gaze caught something completely extraordinary permanently etched into the drying surface. It was an anomaly that would forever alter the trajectory of American criminal justice. There, pressed deeply and with striking, unmistakable clarity into the paint, were the highly detailed, swirling ridges of 4 human fingers belonging to a left hand. It wasn't simply a careless smudge or a blurred smear. It was a perfect, indelible biological signature left behind in the dark. During this primitive era of early 20th century policing, processing a physical crime scene was still a relatively crude, unrefined affair, predominantly relying on hastily drawn pencil sketches and rudimentary, low-contrast photographs that often failed to capture crucial microscopic details. However, the seasoned investigators standing on that porch instinctively recognized the unparalleled, unprecedented magnitude of what they were currently looking at. They fully understood that simply describing these unique, swirling skin patterns in a written police report, or even attempting to photograph them with the era's bulky, primitive camera equipment, would never be enough to legally convince a highly skeptical, scientifically uneducated jury of their importance. Therefore, the authorities made an executive decision to take an extreme, entirely unheard of step in the history of American law enforcement. Requesting a heavy handsaw from their toolkits, the officers literally hacked away at the architecture of the crime scene. They painstakingly sawed off the entire section of the painted wooden railing, carefully wrapping the cumbersome piece of timber to protect the fragile enamel, and physically carried it back to the forensic laboratory to be preserved as an absolute, undeniable piece of physical evidence. When looking back at the complete timeline of this horrific event, there is a profound, almost poetic sense of cosmic justice deeply embedded in this bizarre sequence of discoveries. Clarence Hiller had fought valiantly and desperately in the suffocating darkness of his narrow hallway, ultimately sacrificing his own life in a brutal struggle to shield his sleeping wife and children from a violent nocturnal predator. Yet, even in the tragic silence of death, the hard-working, unassuming railway clerk had somehow managed to strike the final, devastatingly precise blow against his merciless assailant. By simply taking pride in his property and deciding to paint that wooden porch railing on a quiet afternoon, Clarence had unknowingly laid the ultimate, flawless forensic trap. The arrogant killer had successfully slipped through the panicked, shadowy streets and was heavily favored to evade the deeply flawed, outdated physical measurements of the standard Bertillon system. But he could never escape the silent, damning witness he had unwittingly created with his own careless, heavy-handed touch. The heavy oak doors of the Cook County Courthouse finally swung closed, sealing Thomas Jennings inside a grandiose, wood-paneled room where the impending stakes were absolute, irreversible, and inherently grim, a literal matter of life and death. The atmosphere was thick with palpable tension as the highly anticipated trial officially commenced, drawing curious, elbow-to-elbow crowds desperate to catch a glimpse of the man accused of violently shattering the domestic peace of the South Side. Jennings sat rigidly at the defense table, his face a remarkably unreadable mask, while his ultimate fate rested entirely on a cumbersome, sawed-off section of a wooden porch railing that sat ominously in the center of the evidence table. For the prosecution, securing a guilty verdict meant proving the impossible. For the defense, saving their client meant tearing down the very foundations of a scientific revolution before it could even take root. Knowing full well that the circumstantial evidence against his client was dangerously compelling, the defense attorney launched a ferocious, highly theatrical assault on the very concept of fingerprinting itself. Pacing aggressively before the jury box with booming indignation, he actively mocked the prosecution's heavy reliance on these invisible smudges, loudly dismissing the burgeoning field of forensic analysis as little more than unproven magic and dangerous charlatanism. He passionately argued to the panel of 12 ordinary, working-class men that sentencing a human being to the gallows based on a few faint swirls of wet paint was a grave miscarriage of justice, cynically likening the meticulous process to palm reading, voodoo, or a cheap parlor trick designed solely to frame an innocent man. In an era where the general public still inherently trusted the tangible tape measures and rigid metal calipers of the outdated Bertillon system, this aggressive strategy of sowing deep-seated doubt was remarkably effective, leaving the skeptical jurors visibly hesitant to trust this bizarre, invisible science. It wasn't long, however, before the trial reached a critical, highly dramatic juncture, forcing the prosecution to execute a bold, unprecedented maneuver. To actively combat this overwhelming wave of courtroom skepticism, the prosecution called upon a formidable roster of early forensic pioneers, men who had dedicated their quiet laboratory careers to studying the highly unique friction ridges of the human hand. These seasoned experts faced a monumental, almost insurmountable task. They had to take highly complex, abstract scientific principles and distill them into undeniable, easily digestible facts for an entirely uneducated public. Taking the wooden witness stand, they painstakingly explained how the intricate patterns of loops, whorls, and arches naturally form in the mother's womb and remain entirely unchanged throughout a person's entire lifetime, miraculously surviving even severe physical burns and deep dermal abrasions. Yet, as the experts spoke, they could clearly see the glazed, uncertain looks in the eyes of the jurymen. Verbal explanations and dry academic theories alone were simply not enough to break through the rigid, cynical wall of disbelief so carefully constructed by the defense. Realizing that merely hearing about the science was not enough to secure a conviction, the prosecution orchestrated the ultimate courtroom spectacle, a live, highly interactive demonstration designed to completely and irrevocably shatter the jury's skepticism. Right there in the crowded, breathless courtroom, under the watchful eyes of the presiding judge, the forensic experts produced dark ink pads and crisp, clean sheets of white paper, directly inviting the 12 skeptical jurors to participate in a bold scientific experiment. One by one, the hesitant men were instructed to press their own thumbs into the slick black ink and roll them firmly onto the paper, leaving their personal biological signatures behind for the entire court to examine. As the experts carefully passed the freshly inked prints around the box, handing out heavy magnifying glasses and inviting the men to actively scrutinize their own distinct marks, alongside those of their peers, a profound, undeniable realization washed over the jury. They could see with their own naked eyes that not a single looping ridge, not a single microscopic arch, perfectly matched the man sitting right next to them. The suffocating atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from hardened doubt to absolute, chilling shock as these ordinary citizens suddenly understood the terrifying perfection of the evidence before them. The ghostly, painted marks lifted from Clarence Hiller's porch were not a fraudulent trick of the light, but an infallible, inescapable truth that pointed directly at the man sitting at the defense table. Following the breathtaking, highly interactive, live demonstration that had systematically dismantled every ounce of lingering doubt in the room, the 12 working-class men of the jury deliberated with a newfound, unwavering clarity. When they finally returned to the solemn, heavy-air confines of the Cook County courtroom, their highly anticipated verdict echoed like a definitive thunderclap across the silent gallery. Thomas Jennings was officially found guilty of the brutal, senseless murder of Clarence Hiller and was subsequently sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. Yet, for a desperate man staring directly into the terrifying, inescapable abyss of his own mortality, the grueling legal war was still far from over. His fiercely stubborn defense attorneys immediately filed an aggressive appeal, vehemently refusing to accept that a human life could be legally extinguished based entirely on a relatively novel, scientifically complex theory that had never before been definitively tested in the highest echelons of the American judicial system. They argued passionately that admitting those ghostly, invisible marks from the painted porch railing into evidence was a gross, unconstitutional violation of established legal precedent, fundamentally demanding that the higher appellate courts thoroughly review this highly controversial courtroom spectacle. This desperate, 11th-hour legal maneuver effectively paused the executioner's heavy hand, temporarily plunging the tragic, blood-soaked case into a grueling period of bureaucratic limbo, while the overarching fate of modern forensic science hung precariously in the balance. The narrative timeline slowly shifted forward, quietly building immense national anticipation until it culminated on the bitterly cold, historically monumental date of December 21, 1911, when the deeply contested case of People v. Jennings was finally brought before the esteemed justices of the Illinois Supreme Court. These highly educated, deeply conservative legal scholars were strictly tasked with meticulously analyzing every single facet of the lower court's unprecedented decision. acutely aware that their final, published ruling would establish an ironclad legal precedent for generations of future trials. After thoroughly reviewing the exhaustive expert testimonies, examining the physical section of the sawed-off wooden railing, and extensively researching the fundamental biological principles of friction ridges, the highest court in the state delivered a resounding, historically seismic judgment. They officially ruled to uphold the original death penalty sentence, definitively declaring in their written opinion that there was a universally recognized, undeniable scientific basis for the systematic identification of individuals by their fingerprints. The sheer unprecedented magnitude of this specific legal ruling simply cannot be overstated in the grand, sweeping tapestry of American legal history. For the absolute first time since the inception of the United States justice system, a state Supreme Court had formally, legally validated and recognized fingerprint analysis as an entirely legitimate, deeply reliable form of criminal evidence, permanently cementing the painted smudges from the Hiller home into the bedrock of modern jurisprudence. The profound, immediate shockwaves generated by this single landmark appellate decision violently shattered the archaic foundations of early 20th century policing across the entire nation. Almost overnight, the deeply flawed, mathematically exhausting Bertillon system was rendered completely and irrevocably obsolete, violently exposing the dangerous vulnerabilities of relying on fading human memory and easily manipulated physical body measurements. Massive, smoke-filled police departments, from the bustling, chaotic streets of New York to the foggy, industrial harbors of San Francisco, eagerly began throwing out their cumbersome wooden calipers and rigid cloth tape measures, rapidly replacing them with simple, highly effective dark ink pads and standardized fingerprint filing cards. Career criminals who had previously exploited the glaring blind spots of the old administrative systems by constantly changing their names and deliberately altering their facial appearances suddenly found themselves securely, inescapably tethered to their own immutable biological signatures. The tragic, terrifying loss of a hard-working railway clerk on the south side of Chicago had inadvertently served as the violent catalyst for a monumental scientific revolution, effectively closing the dark, unrefined chapter of 19th century investigative methods and officially ushering the United States into the highly precise, relentlessly unforgiving modern era of forensic science. With the landmark ruling from the Illinois Supreme Court firmly establishing an impenetrable legal wall, Thomas Jennings finally exhausted the very last of his desperate judicial appeals. The grim machinery of the American justice system, now heavily fortified by an undeniable scientific truth, moved forward with absolute mechanical certainty. On the cold, unforgiving morning of February 16, 1912, the shadow that had once violently breached the peace of the South Side was finally led to the heavy wooden gallows. As the trapdoor swung open and Jennings was hanged by the neck until dead, it marked the definitive, brutal conclusion of his own dark, predatory narrative. However, the true story of that humid September night did not end with the snapping of a hangman's rope. While the executions successfully provided a necessary measure of closure for a grieving, shattered family, the profound, far-reaching ripples of this single criminal case were already beginning to wash over the entire globe, fundamentally rewriting the deeply flawed rules of criminal investigation. The phantom had been caught, completely eradicated by the very system he had so arrogantly believed he could easily outsmart with a torn coat and a stubbornly sealed lip. When one steps back to examine the vast, sweeping panorama of this historic tragedy, it is impossible to ignore the profound, almost haunting poetic justice intricately woven into the final hours of Clarence Hiller's life. He was not a hardened, world-weary detective, nor was he a brilliant, trailblazing forensic scientist working in a sterile laboratory. He was simply a dedicated, hard-working railway clerk who possessed a deep, unwavering love for his family and a quiet pride in his modest urban home. On that seemingly ordinary, sunlit afternoon, when he picked up a brush to carefully apply a thick, wet coat of white enamel to his rear porch railing, he was performing a beautifully mundane, innocent domestic chore. Yet, that solitary act of suburban maintenance became the ultimate, inescapable snare for a ruthless predator. Clarence Hiller fought valiantly and violently in the suffocating darkness to shield his sleeping wife and children, ultimately paying the absolute highest price a father can possibly pay. But even as his life tragically ebbed away on that wooden staircase, the freshly painted banister stood silently outside, capturing the invisible biological signature of his murderer. The victim had unknowingly reached beyond the grave, utilizing the simplest of household tasks to reach out and firmly grab his killer by the hand, ensuring that his own tragic death would be the very catalyst that altered the unyielding course of justice forever. The legacy of that chaotic, blood-soaked night in 1910 Chicago extends far beyond the fading, yellowed pages of early 20th century legal archives. It lives on vibrantly in the modern, highly sophisticated realm of global law enforcement. Today, we live in a world completely saturated by advanced forensic technology, where sprawling, digitized databases can systematically cross-reference millions of biometric signatures in a matter of mere seconds. Yet, every single time, a modern crime scene investigator carefully steps under the yellow police tape, meticulously dusting a shattered window pane with fine black powder, or raising a specialized ultraviolet light to reveal the hidden swirling ridges left behind by a careless hand, they owe an immense, unpayable historical debt to the Hiller family. The foundational, unshakable trust we currently place in fingerprint analysis was not born easily in a quiet academic vacuum. It was forged in the terrifying chaos of a midnight struggle and legally sanctified by a group of skeptical jurors who dared to believe in a revolutionary, invisible science. The silent witness that once convicted Thomas Jennings continues to speak for countless voiceless victims today, actively ensuring that no matter how seamlessly a criminal believes they have melted into the shadows, their own body will eventually betray them. As we gently close the heavy, dusty cover on this remarkable chapter of criminal history, I want to turn the final question over to you. Imagine yourself sitting in that crowded, stifling Cook County courtroom back in 1910, a time when the very concept of fingerprinting was widely considered by the general public to be nothing more than elaborate magic and forensic fraud. If you had been sitting in that jury box, looking at those faint, painted smudges, would the live courtroom demonstration have been enough to convince you to send a man to the gallows? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the dark, forgotten origins of true crime and the landmark cases that shaped our modern world, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more gripping historical investigations. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, stay safe out there.